I'm assuming that everyone can now see my screen. Peter Brown started things off this morning by offering us a motto: fortune favors only well-prepared minds. And through the morning, we've had a succession of examples of the various educational and pedagogical triumphs that well-prepared minds have been able to achieve. But the purpose in this part of the program is to remind you that well-prepared minds need to operate in appropriate frameworks. Fortune favors only well-prepared minds who have the good fortune to work within well-prepared education systems. And as Sarah's already said, my focus is on aligning curriculum and teaching learning. And when I've done that, I'll hand over to José Noijons, who will talk about the role of assessment. Let me start by reminding you of two challenges that COVID presents us with. The first has to do with distance learning. Effective distance learning requires a great deal more than a reliable laptop, a stable internet connection, and a quiet room. It prompts the question, to what extent are our students capable of being autonomous learners? How effectively do we help them to develop skills of self-management? Is that something that has been central to our teaching approaches prior to COVID, or has it not? And do we keep our fingers crossed and hope that they'll be able to work it out themselves online? Assuming that we do set out to help them to develop skills of self-management, are we providing them with appropriate tools? And as they manage their own learning, how effectively are they able to monitor their own progress in relation to curriculum goals? And the second challenge has to do with assessment. The cancellation of public exams has thrown some education systems into chaos. When exams are not criterion referenced, the grades awarded by teachers are at best guesswork. And I suspect that that is the single most important factor in explaining the widespread grade inflation that's been taking place. Alternative modes of assessment, teacher assessment, but also self-assessment, are widely thought to lack reliability. And we need to come up with solutions to these challenges, assessment, but also distance learning, that are going to equip us to face an uncertain future, rather than looking back to the comfort of the old ways. My response to these two challenges is to offer you an old argument, but one that has been given, I think, new relevance by COVID-19. The argument goes like this. The CFR challenges us to develop a new pedagogical culture in which learning and assessment are inseparable, two sides of the same coin. This challenge derives from the fact that each of the CFR's can-do descriptors can be used simultaneously to specify a learning outcome, curriculum, provide a learning focus, teaching and learning, and imply an assessment task. In other words, the CFR is an instrument for aligning curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment with one another. What's more, learners themselves can participate fully in this new culture, participate in ways that empower them, that energize their agency and promote their autonomy. Because from early childhood, we know what we can and cannot do. And the can-do descriptors, which are at the heart of the CFR's scales of proficiency, are primarily behaviorally oriented. The European language portfolio was conceived as a way of mediating the CFR's ethos and approach to learners and enabling them to manage their own language learning on the basis of reflection driven by self-assessment. The CFR, in other words, enables us to construct what Barry O'Sullivan calls a comprehensive learning system. This triangular diagram is taken from his 2020 publication on this topic. Curriculum, delivery, by which he means teaching and learning materials and all the other things that support teaching and learning, and assessment are held in balance in this equilateral triangle. And I suppose from the Council of Europe's point of view, it's important to note that the triangle as it's offered here lacks one crucial feature, which is the learner. The curriculum should meet the learner's needs, educational, communicative, and so on. Teaching and materials and all the other things associated with delivery should be geared to, again, the learner's needs and exploit the learner's interests and motivations. And assessment should enable us to arrive at a valid and reliable portrait of the learner's competences. The steps in building a learner-centered comprehensive learning system go like this. First of all, we have to define the body of knowledge and skills that the curriculum aims at. And then we can go on to use the CFR companion volume to draw up a detailed description of the target repertoire. Here's an example from the companion volume itself. An example of a curriculum based on an analysis of learner needs, in this case, lower secondary CLIL, content and language integrated learning. The curriculum focuses on the 4 language activities of reception, production, interaction, and mediation. And for each of those activities, the curriculum developer has identified the relevant scales and then has identified the level of proficiency to be achieved in relation to each scale, which explains the irregular profile around the reception, interaction, production, mediation part of the diagram. So that, for example, for production, sustained monologue, giving information, describing experience, is required to be achieved at a higher level than creative writing, which in turn is higher than reports and essays. This is not a trivial undertaking. Very few curricula that claim to be aligned to the CFR, however, are based on this kind of analysis, deconstruction, and reconstruction. But if we do this, we end up with an inventory of can-do descriptors, scaled such that we can organize them in order across a curriculum that may last 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. When we've done that, we have to provide teachers and students with tools that help them to convert an action-oriented description of curriculum content into action-oriented teaching and learning. In other words, that enable them to pursue language learning through language use. Now, tools can take various forms, but in relation to this kind of curriculum, I think a key tool is the checklist of I can descriptors. What you see on the screen now is a generic example referring to A2 listening. Because checklists of I can descriptors enable the teacher to mediate curriculum goals to their learners in a fine-grained way. And if you have a curriculum that spreads over a number of years, clearly the goals for each successive year can be captured in a series of I can descriptor checklists. These checklists enable learners, of course, to identify learning targets, to discuss what they're doing, and of course, to monitor and assess their progress. That's the in the European language portfolio. When we've got our curriculum structured around a collection of can-do descriptors from the CFR, and we've got tools that will help teachers and learners to convert this description of curriculum content into action-oriented learning, then we need to teach for learner autonomy, to teach for learner empowerment, to teach for learner agency, which means involving learners in planning, managing, and evaluating their learning, showing them how to use the ELP or some other kind of portfolio. It means using can-do and I can descriptors to develop learners' reflective understanding of the capacities the curriculum wants them to develop. And it means assigning a central role to a recursive cycle of goal setting and self-assessment using I can checklists. By working in this way, teachers and learners gradually accumulate a body of evidence. Evidence on the learning process, evidence on learning outcomes that they can relate to the can-do specification of the curriculum. And this enables teachers to make clear criterion-referenced judgments regarding the progress of individual learners and the class as a whole. The fourth step is to design exams that reflect the action-oriented, task-based nature of the curriculum. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I stop sharing my screen and hand over to José.
Thank you, David. Yes, as you've heard, David has focused on curriculum development in line with the CFR. And now I would like to focus a bit more on the assessment in line with the CFR in times of COVID. And I do this as a coordinator of the RELANG project. And I'll just tell you what the RELANG project is about. We help countries in Europe relating language curricula, tests and examinations to the CFR. Secondly, this is a cooperation between the European Centre for Modern Languages, the ECML, where I'm now, and the European Commission. And a total of some 80 workshops have already been administered, given in 30 European countries. And this year alone, we had 13 live and online workshops, most of them online, I'm afraid. And assessment in times of COVID was not so much the subject of these workshops, but of course, we heard a lot of the experiences in the various countries that we visited. Now, one of the issues that we always meet when discussing the exams and the tests that countries provide is that they claim that tests or exams are linked to the CFR and more specifically linked to a particular level, A1, A2, etc. But what we find is that there's hardly ever an indication of the score required for the CFR level in question. Because passing an exam doesn't always mean that you're up at that level. There may be a difference in the score, the pass score, and the score that you need to be called a B1 speaker, a B1 writer, etc. Now, for tests with a numerical score, such as reading and listening, we need performance standards. These standards, these scores, if you like, are important when we try and link exams to the CFR. And the same goes, but it is a bit more difficult to achieve in the case of the direct tests of speaking and writing, where we use typical examples of performances at a particular level to formulate the standard. Now, let's have a look at two more issues that will come up in the discussion of assessment in times of COVID. First of all, there is this idea of validity. And we claim in assessment that a test is valid if it measures what we intend to measure. So if we say that this test assesses reading, then we want to have proof that it is reading that we are assessing and not grammar or vocabulary. They are important, but they're not really reading. And another thing is that we need to demonstrate, and that's the standard again, that the learner reported to be at B1 is actually at B1, according to the evidence. And another phenomenon is reliability. And in assessment, reliability means consistency, that we have the same or similar results on repeated use of a particular test. In practice, this is done through statistics because in practice it is difficult to carry out. And we need to remember that high reliability doesn't mean that the test is valid. You can produce a pencil and paper test with multiple choice questions for speaking and ask the student, what would you say in this circumstance? And I can assure you that such tests probably are more reliable than a live test where a student actually talks. But clearly, we wouldn't say that that test is valid. So remember, the reliability may not be an indication of validity. And also remember that reliability means consistency. Now, let's have a look at assessment in times of COVID. In one of the countries, I met a ministry official and I asked her, can you tell me how did you cope with all these difficulties? Well, this is what she wrote to me. Despite difficulties due to the pandemic, the exams were carried out as usual, taking, of course, into consideration the amount of subject matter covered. And also, additionally, the marking was a bit more lenient than the years before. Now, let's first have a look at this first bit. Taking, of course, into consideration the amount of subject matter covered. Now, that works in the case of subjects like history or biology. The exam would not contain certain chapters that weren't dealt with during that difficult year. But in the case of a language examination, how can we do this? I mean, you can't possibly suddenly leave out a writing bit and say, okay, because of COVID, we will not test writing. This would make that exam rather invalid. But also, let's look at the second bit of this quotation. The marking was a bit more lenient than the years before. And I wasn't sure whether she really meant the marking, but this is indeed what the instruction was. The raters were asked not to be too strict on mistakes that the students were making. And again, I would argue that that has influenced the validity of the exam. A better way out possibly was to say, okay, we have this test. Until now, we said that a score of this much meant that you passed the exam, and a score of this much meant that you were at a level, a B1 level, for example. Now you can sort of downgrade the grade a bit, and you can say, okay, this year with so many points, fewer points than last year when there was no COVID, we still say you have passed. But there is a problem in the case that the exam is linked to the CFR. Because if you then have lowered your standard, if you like, you can't possibly say anymore that that student is at B1, because the standard, the B1 standard hasn't changed. The B1 standard is stronger than COVID, it's there, although of course people don't always agree what B1 is, but still it is not influenced by COVID. Another example of issues in the case of assessment in times of COVID is this wonderful reply by someone in the ECML survey. This person said, the teacher never knows who is really taking the test. As a parent, I also took tests for my daughter because her class teacher gave her too much work. So this is a teacher actually taking tests for her daughter or his daughter. Now, I hope you realize that this is an issue of validity and not of reliability, because cynically speaking, if this person does this consistently, and she seems to be doing that, he seems to be doing that, I took tests plural for my daughter, then the results are consistent. But the only problem is that you're not testing what the daughter is capable of, but what the teacher is capable of. So we have to rethink this idea of reliability that you meet a lot in the reports on what's happening in times of COVID. And another example of that is here, where in the report on the ECML survey, it says, with the question, the following question, the effect of the pandemic on examination, it's plural. Majority of respondents, over 60%, believe that the lack of supervision during tests and during exams had reduced their reliability. Again, my point is that this is much more a matter of validity. But then at last, there is some hopeful news as well. Hopeful news that you've heard from Bernd and Peter earlier today. 90% believe that continuous assessment had permitted fair and accurate evaluation of learners' performance, and that continuous assessment had reduced the stress on learners. Just take this little bit at the end. Continuous assessment had reduced the stress. The point being that if a test creates a lot of stress, you're not only testing the ability of the student for the subject that you're testing, but you're also testing their stress resilience. And clearly then you're making your test less valid. So this is good. Continuous assessment seems to have reduced the stress on learners. So we must remember this. Another quotation from a case study. It said, however, there were students who did not have access to a laptop or PC, and it was difficult for them to present their projects via their mobile phones. So the teacher is supposed to assess all of this, but the student didn't have access to a laptop or PC. And again, this morning we've heard this a number of times, that there are such students that have to share their laptop, or when there is a laptop, with their siblings and sometimes with their parents. But again, so if you assess, when you assess a person like that, who has no experience with PCs, etc., then you are creating a problem that can be called a validity issue again. But again, there was a positive feedback from COVID. So COVID does things well, if you like. Surprisingly, most students were not reluctant to participate, in contrast to having to present their projects in class. This is interesting, that through COVID, we have learned to understand that some students feel better when they can use something like a mobile phone rather than stand in front of the class and be nervous and not knowing what to say. So we heard about continuous assessment, and what we find, in fact, is that teachers have now replaced standardized pencil and paper tests by alternative formats of assessment, such as interviews, logs and journals, peer conferences, projects, presentations. All of that is a positive development. And the overall goal of alternative assessment, in fact, is to allow students to demonstrate their knowledge in unique and innovative ways. And some of the characteristics of alternative assessment are that the data are gathered over a period of time. And we will come to that in a moment, but this is much better than having a one-time standardized test on one day and then decide on the future of the student. It enables us to measure progress. It's usually formative, but hopefully we will be able to join formative assessment and summative assessment. Usually it's low stakes, but thanks to COVID, we are now moving towards a period where such assessment can be used in high stakes environments as well. And of course, there is positive pushback, and that's important as well. My conclusions, but not only my conclusions, would be that COVID-19 has made us realize that we may need to raise the validity of assessment. And I put 3 conclusions here in italics because they are little quotations from one teacher, which means that I think lots of teachers, and we heard Peter and Bernd say this morning as well, teachers are very much aware of this now too. Flexibility and training is necessary, especially in assessment practices. Disadvantaged students should be supported, for example, in learning difficulties when there are economic issues, when there are many siblings and no electronic equipment available. And students need to be better trained and prepared to work remotely, develop digital literacy skills. These are literal quotations from just one person. And may I add my own conclusions here? We need to be much more aware of students' different social backgrounds and think of this when we test, because it influences the validity of our test. If you're not careful, you're not only testing what a student can do, but what his or her background is just as much. We need to collect more validated evidence of students' competencies, as I said, than one-off standardized tests can provide. I'm not against, not at all, these standardized tests at the end of secondary education. For all sorts of purposes, we need them, but they're not the only evidence. And teachers need to be trained to acquire a new educational literacy. And this, in fact, refers to a presentation later on today by Bernd Rischoff and Peter Brown when they talk about a new educational literacy. Thank you very much.